the foundation of the Constitution. That's how Thomas Jefferson described the 10th Amendment. And for good reason, too, because it's built upon many of the very same principles, the foundation that sparked the American Revolution, some of these principles that even helped shape his words in the Declaration of Independence. So in this episode, we're going to explore 5 of these top revolutionary ideas and principles, the foundation that's been ignored for far too long. First of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, June 24th, 2024. And since here at the TAC, we're commemorating our 18-year anniversary this week, I can hardly believe we've survived this long. Let's dive right into these top 5 foundational principles behind the 10th Amendment. Again, thank you so much for being a part of this with me. First of all, number 1, all power comes from the people. And to start this out, we have to understand the radical change in the viewpoints of the people, the real American Revolution that went from around 1760 through 1775, the shot heard round the world before the War for Independence. This was the real American Revolution. Before that, people lived under a doctrine called the divine right of kings. And here from Wiki, a nice overview. The doctrine asserts that a monarch is not accountable to any earthly authority, such as the people or a pope, because their right to rule is derived from divine authority. Thus, the monarch is not subject to the will of the people, of the aristocracy, or of any other estate of the realm. In other words, they just have total power. But the people began to view power as having a different source. First of all, David Ramsay, in his History of the American Revolution from 1789, described it a little bit further. He said, James, educated in the arbitrary sentiments of the divine right of kings, conceived his subjects to be his property, and that their privileges were matters of grace and favor flowing from his generosity. This high claim of prerogative excited opposition in support of the rights of the people. And we see writers, of course, like John Locke, but there's also Algernon Sidney in his great Discourses Concerning Government, which he wrote but never published. He was put to death for merely writing these types of things in the late 17th century. He was seen as a martyr for liberty, a hero to the American revolutionaries. And here in section 20, he's got a whole section of his book. It was published posthumously after his death. All just power is from the people. And we see this recited over and over in the founding generation from the old revolutionaries. I think George Mason put it best in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, passed in June of 1776. He said, all power, all of it, is vested in and consequently derived from the people. Magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. And then during the New York Ratifying Convention, we can see this also brought forward to the ratification debates over the Constitution. The chairman, Robert Livingston, said the ability of the U.S., these United States, the ability of the United States to live in peace was heavily due to the fact that they acknowledged the same great principle, that all power is derived from the people. And here from Enos Hitchcock, this is an interesting oration. We find a lot of these, especially in the early Republic, an oration in commemoration of independence. This is July 4th, 1793. He said, no longer do we subscribe to the absurd doctrine of the divine right of kings. No longer bow our necks to the galling yoke of foreign legislation. Independent of these servilities, we enjoy the divine right of governing ourselves. Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776, of course, hugely popular, widely printed, published, purchased, widely read. This was certainly spent a lot of time railing against this notion of a divine right to rule. So number 1 is that all power comes from the people. And number 2, naturally flowing from that, is sovereignty is in the people. Now, since the people are the source of all power, they also have final say. Sovereignty is final say over their own power. This was a radical view, of course, at the time. Mike Meharry discusses in his article on this, I believe this is Sovereignty and Agency. It'll be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. He's been doing a lot of incredible writing, some very long pieces as well. So we got probably a couple more ebooks to publish in the near future. But he shares the British viewpoint on this. And he said the Massachusetts royal governor, Sir Francis Bernard, summarized the British conception of power of sovereignty in 1764. He started by asserting that the British government was, quote, not subordinate to or dependent on any earthly power. So they said that, of course, they held the view that they had the divine right to rule. The king in parliament is how they refer to it. But they also, on top of that, because where they get their power from, according to their viewpoint, they also have final authority over their own power. He goes further. The king in parliament has the sole right of legislation and the supreme superintendency of the government. And in this plenitude of power is absolute, uncontrollable, and unaccountable to none, and therefore, in a political sense, can do no wrong. That was the view of sovereignty under the monarchy. Can do no wrong. James Otis Jr., of course, took this to pieces in The Rights of the British Colonies, Asserted and Proved, 1764. He said, an original supreme sovereign, absolute and uncontrollable earthly power, of course, he's not rejecting a divine power, but an earthly power must exist and preside over every society, from whose final decisions there can be no appeal but directly to heaven. We might be thinking of a flag, appeal to heaven, for example, but this is a reference to that mentality. He said, it is therefore originally and ultimately in the people. I say this supreme, absolute power is originally and ultimately in the people. That's James Otis Jr. We also have Thomas Paine. I'm not citing common sense today, but Dissertations on Government in 1786, another very interesting tract from Paine. He explained the difference, how this plays out. In despotic monarchies, he said, this power is lodged in a single person or sovereign. To be sovereign means you have final say, ultimate authority. His will is law, which he declares, alters, or revokes as he pleases, without being accountable to any power for so doing. But in a republic, such as those established in America, he said, the sovereign power, or the power over which there is no control and which controls all others, remains where nature placed it, in the people. For the people in America are the fountain of power. So we're tying these two together, the source of power and the final say over that power as well. And we see this same view brought forward by James Wilson in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention and many others during the ratification debates. And he put it this way: the truth is that in our governments, the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power remains in the people. Now, he's recognized, he doesn't even have to say it, but he's not saying it comes from, we're not saying power to the people. That's literally begging to take it back. When you have sovereignty, you don't have to ask for power back. You just take it. It has always been there in the first place, even if you've decided not to use it. So it always has been there, James Wilson recognizes, just like James Otis and Thomas Paine and others. And it remains there. He said, as our constitutions are superior to our legislatures, so the people are superior to our constitutions. We see or to the people in the 10th Amendment, for example. Even Alexander Hamilton gets on this, and he said to deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant is above the master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men acting by virtue of powers may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. So Alexander Hamilton, writing in Federalist 78, who knows how much of this he actually meant, but certainly this convinced the people, like this is what the system was founded on. But this is a very strong principle that no one was really denying at the time. This was a universally understood maxim by the founders and the old revolutionaries, that power comes from the people, and because of that, they have final say over their own power. And on top of this, what Hamilton is also hinting at here is that government is an agent of the people. That's number 3. They aren't our rulers. I know we often hear even the founding generation, when I cite quotes from even James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, many others, they refer to people with power as rulers. And we think about the context today. We're like, no, they're not our rulers, but certainly that's how they act today, even more so than they certainly should. Let's go back to James Otis Jr. Here in 1765. He said, the trustees, council, or senate so chosen are in fact representatives of and agents for the whole society. This is an understanding that the people that are supposedly representing you, even though it's impossible with so few people in the Imperial Congress to properly represent the people, this is just nonsense. The Anti-Federalists told us over and over and over it would be impossible to have real representation without far more representatives. But they're acting as agents for certain swaths of society or agents of the states. That would be the senators are supposed to be agents of the states. He said, if the society agrees to have but one trustee, representative, or agent, he is a monarch. If they make choice of a council or senate, they are joint agents, trustees, or representatives of the whole community. Upon so simple a principle are all governments originally built. And this is James Otis Jr. in September of 1765. We also see again in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which inspired so much else, the Declaration of Independence and many other documents going forward throughout history. All power is vested in and consequently derived from the people, as I cited earlier. He said, but magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. So government is meant to be an agent of the people. Now, of course, that's not how it acts today, but we have to start out with these foundational principles if we ever want things to be a real land of the free rather than a largest government in history. John Jay, the future first Chief Justice of the United States, during the ratification debates, we can see these revolutionary principles again brought forward to the debates over the Constitution. He describes the entire structure of the Constitution very similar to what Thomas Jefferson was saying later on, that the 10th Amendment, of course, was the foundation of the Constitution because it's about delegated and reserved powers. It's about the people being the source of power, that government is their agent and people have the final say. But here's how John Jay put it. The Constitution only serves to point out that part of the people's business which they think proper by it to refer to the management of the persons therein designated. Those persons are to receive that business to manage, not for themselves and as their own, but as agents and overseers for the people to whom they are constantly responsible and by whom only they are to be appointed. Again, acting as agents of the people, we see the same mentality on the Anti-Federalist side. One of the leading ones is Patrick Henry, one of my favorites from the founding generation. He says the governing persons are the servants of the people. Now, his argument here in this debate in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June of 1788, he's basically saying this system isn't going to play out like this. We can say certainly that maybe Patrick Henry was onto something there, but the structure, the way it's supposed to be, is that the governing persons are mere servants of the people. And if you think of that term servant, that really means, well, quite a bit. Now, this is all going to be linked to in the show notes. I already mentioned 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But if you're thinking like, Bolden, where's that 1765 document from James Otis Jr. or that address from John Jay or whatever, or Mike Meharry's articles that I'm citing in this episode, you're going to find them all linked to in a blog post like we do for every single episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley does an awesome job organizing the blog post for every episode. He includes a show links section, but in each episode blog post, there's also all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and X and LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitch. We also live stream over at Odyssey.com and Rumble.com, and we're on all the audio-only podcast locations that I can think of or get us on quickly and easily, but maybe we're missing from one. So if we're missing from a platform that you prefer to use, please do let me know either in a comment in the archive or email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I do read through virtually all of these things but it's rare that I have the opportunity to reply to very many, but I do appreciate your feedback and input. And while I'm mentioning that, I also want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Dennis and Brewster and Gypsy and a few others over on rumble.com, on YouTube and Facebook and elsewhere. We've got Senator DT, MT Pockets, Kirk, Bastiat, Sparrow. Scrolling through here, there's Kirk. Maybe I mentioned Kirk twice. Haji and Brewster over here as well. Senator DT. I appreciate you guys all being here. I know I'm probably mentioning a couple names more than once because there's a lot of interesting back and forth going on. But again, I really appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. So we've gone through a few of these. Power comes from the people. Sovereignty, final authority is in the people. 3, government is only supposed to be a servant or an agent of the people. And then 4, power must have defined limits. And if we're thinking about the original legal meaning of the Constitution, hammered home by the foundation of the Constitution, that of a dividing line between state and federal power, what John Taylor of Caroline said is the most important thing to preserve liberty, what Samuel Adams called the palladium of liberty, separating that power as well. For the old revolutionaries, if we think about the people who went through the revolution, that radical change in viewpoints of the people, a government could only exercise whatever power it decided. A government that could do that, exercise any power, was claiming arbitrary power. This is the very definition of a tyranny. James Otis Jr. described arbitrary power like this: arbitrary, which in plain English means no more than do as one pleases. So government had to have defined limits, otherwise it was an arbitrary government, and it would do it as it pleases. And that in and of itself is a tyranny. James Otis Jr. also referred to this as the curse and scandal of human nature. And if you really want to dig deep into that philosophically, he's saying so much. He's recognizing that if all humans were angels, let's say we were all perfectly good moral people, and they all agreed with me on everything, of course, right? I'm a pretty flawed creature myself. But if human beings were all perfect moral creatures, then you could give government unlimited power and people would only do the right thing, would only do what is good. In essence, it would get the heck out of the way in almost every situation. But because human beings are drawn to, well, make bad decisions, and the worst of society are drawn to positions of power, the more power that government has, well, the more that they're going to try to get there to use and abuse it. So this is the curse and scandal of human nature, is arbitrary power, according to the great James Otis Jr. Arbitrary power was also included as one of the injuries and usurpations. We often called them grievances in the Declaration of Independence. I covered that in an entire episode a couple of years ago. Arbitrary government, how the founders defined tyranny. I haven't listened to it in a while, but the topic sounds pretty awesome to me. So that'll be linked to in the show notes. Alan will get that included there as well. So you can check it out on your own time and let me know if it's good, if it's awesome, if it sucks, or anything in between. Now, Luther Martin, if we're jumping forward to see these same types of principles during ratification debates over the Constitution, Luther Martin, in his Genuine Information, he noted that by the principles of the American Revolution, arbitrary power may and ought to be resisted, even by arms if necessary. So the idea that a government goes beyond its limits and exercises arbitrary power, this is a usurpation of power. St. George Tucker, later in 1803, called this treason against the sovereignty of the people. James Iredell, one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court, nominated by George Washington, said the people will resist if government usurps power. This is the same thing. Federalists and anti-federalists taking the same position because the principles of the American Revolution tell us that the people are supposed to resist when government steals power that doesn't belong to them. They have to have limits. Marilyn Farmer put it this way: all human authority, however organized, it doesn't matter what system you're supporting or maybe no system at all, but human authority, if human beings have power, it has to have limits. It must have confined limits, or insolence and oppression will prove the offspring of its grandeur, and the difficulty, or rather impossibility of escape prevents resistance. So government must have limits. All power must have limits. And most importantly, as I'm kind of hinting at here, mentioning it over and over, talking about resistance from Luther Martin and James Iredell. It's up to the people. Just because the people is sovereign and government is supposed to be their agent doesn't mean that the government is just going to magically follow the rules given to it. That should be so blatantly obvious to all of us by this point. So it's up to somebody else other than the government to limit the power of the government. Because when you rely on government to limit itself, it doesn't matter which team you have in power, that government power always grows and grows and grows. Even if it takes a little dip in size, if you zoom out, government power is always increasing. Your liberty is always getting less and less and less. So it's up to the people. The founding generation all told us this, even during the Revolution. John Dickinson, in his great broadside against the Stamp Act in 1765, he described it like this. The Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. So the mentality going back to the early part of the American Revolution, the resistance to the Stamp Act was, if you comply, you're always going to get more and more and more. So it's up to the people to resist and refuse to comply. Just like Luther Martin was saying, if we're going to apply the principles of the revolution to what we live under today, this is December of 1787, as they were considering whether or not to ratify the Constitution. They're saying, well, you have to have a people that are willing to resist any usurpations of power, any arbitrary power. James Otis Jr., who we cite often when it comes to especially the early part of the Revolution, here writing as freeborn American in 1767. He said, "It is, my countrymen, of the utmost consequence that we boldly oppose the least infraction of our charter and our rights as men." We boldly oppose the least infraction of our charter and rights as men. It doesn't matter how big or small the infraction may be. We have to boldly oppose it. It's the utmost consequence that it's done, because if not, we're going to end up with all kinds of bad stuff. John Dickinson in 1765, in that same broadside against the Stamp Act, referred to it as the detestable precedent. That's why he's like, look, even if you think this is just a small deal, it's not a huge tax, as soon as you bend your neck to that yoke, they're going to use it to establish more and more of the same. And certainly, the penman of the American Revolution was absolutely right. So back to James Otis Jr. Obsta principiis, it's a Latin phrase, he said, is a maxim never to be forgot. If we do not resist at the first attack, it may soon be too late. Obsta principiis means nip it in the bud, nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. And even the best constitution. So as they decided to say, okay, this whole unwritten British Constitution where they have the divine right of kings and they have the final authority, even if we're asserting over here in America, we're asserting that, well, power comes from the people and you can only do certain things. Patrick Henry, for example, said, you can tax these things, but internal taxation, well, none of us are going to obey this. We are not bound to yield obedience to this type of thing. So even if you have that mentality, without a written constitution, they've got all kinds of wiggle room to expand that. But just because you write stuff down doesn't magically fix things either. As we can certainly see, there's all kinds of stuff written down on a document, but words on paper don't enforce themselves. They never did. They never will. John Dickinson, who we can say, we can call him the penman of the American Revolution. He's probably the father of the Articles of Confederation. He was also one of the leading supporters of ratification of the Constitution. When he was supporting the Constitution in 1788, he specifically said, a good Constitution promotes, but does not always produce a good administration. And of course, vice versa. So the idea of having a good Constitution is to make it easier for the people to understand where things are going kind of off the rails. Now, unfortunately, we've got some vague terms and people are easily confused and they don't spend time educating themselves. So the source of the problem and the solution to the problem is the people themselves, really. So James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, recognized this principle as well, writing in Federalist 48 that even the best Constitution is a mere parchment barrier that needs enforcement. And there's a couple of phrases. Let me see if I can read this extra piece here as well. He said, scrolling up here. Man, I am just... Well, he multiple times in Federalist 48 referred to it as a parchment barrier. He said basically, I'm going to paraphrase this. He said this has been basically what the drafters of the other constitutions, the state constitutions, have basically relied on. Get the really good stuff written on paper, but we can see how it's played out. That has not stopped people with power from trying to expand their own power. And he summed up Federalist 48 with this: a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. James Madison was so much in support of separation of powers, primarily from Montesquieu, 1748, the spirit of the law. He was so on board with that he actually wanted to include with the 10th Amendment a new Article 7 as an amended into the body of the Constitution, what became the 10th Amendment, along with separation of powers, to make it really, really clear that this had to be straightforward stuff. But even though he wanted that in the body of the Constitution, he's saying just putting it on paper is not enough. Writing it down is not enough. It is up to the people. It is as James Otis Jr. said, it's up to the utmost consequence that we boldly oppose the least infraction of our charter or our Constitution. Or as John Dickinson said, if you quietly bend your neck to whatever they decide to throw at you, even if they're not authorized to do it, you shouldn't be surprised when they throw more and more and more at you over time under that detestable precedent. Just days after Madison published Federalist number 48 in February of 1788, we have the last day of the Massachusetts ratifying convention. I'm not sure if John Hancock had read it at this point, but certainly he was urging the people to vote for ratification, even though he was pretty silent on it. He and Samuel Adams generally didn't like a lot of stuff in the Constitution. We know that John Hancock was very likely drafting recommended amendments as early as just weeks or days after the Philadelphia Convention was done. He wanted to see things different. The first thing that they made a deal on was what became what was really a precursor to the 10th Amendment. It was about a dividing line between federal and state powers, about delegated and reserved powers. And when he was giving his speech to say, okay, let's go forward with this. We've got to deal with the Federalists. We're going to get our amendments. We can set aside the fact that Richard Henry Lee and Samuel Adams were discussing this in 1789 after the Constitution went into effect. And Richard Henry Lee, who was an anti-Federalist who wanted to see a Bill of Rights and a division of state and federal power included in the Constitution even before it went to the states for ratification, he worked very hard on that. He was in the Senate. And he's telling Samuel Adams, like, look, we made this agreement with these Federalists, and now they're trying to go back on it. So it took a lot of pressure, even a year and a half later, just to get him to go forward with what they promised. So we don't know if the promise was real, but John Hancock made this deal to say, he and Samuel Adams made this deal to say, okay, we will vote to ratify as long as you make this promise that we are going to get amendments. And the primary one, the first one that they recommended in Massachusetts, what Thomas Jefferson, writing from France, multiple times said, at first, I wanted to see 9 states ratify, so it went into effect, and the other 4 reject the Constitution, so it could force either another convention or it could force amendments somewhere down the line. He said, but once I learned of the plan of Massachusetts, Mr. Hancock's plan, that is far preferable, because he thought that was the best approach. But anyways, Hancock put it this way: the powers reserved by the people render them secure. Having a power to protect your liberty isn't very useful if you don't use it. So it's pretty much implied that the powers reserved by the people render them secure if they use it. And back to John Dickinson, writing in Fabius number 4 in 1788, where he said, a good constitution promotes, but does not always produce a good administration. So he says, hey, what's going to happen? He said, but notwithstanding, it must be granted that a bad administration may take place. Man, that sounds like a perfect description of every administration I've lived under. A bad administration may take place. He said, what is to be done? He said, the answer is to be found instantly before the supreme sovereignty of the people. The people, the source of all power, have the final say over their own power that they've delegated to their agents. And if their agents, their administration, isn't doing the stuff that it's supposed to be doing, or it's doing stuff that it's not authorized to do, then the answer is to the supreme source of all power, the people themselves. He said it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase on perilous occasions, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. And summing it up, Thomas Jefferson said, without this right of the people of the states to make this determination, to correct errors of the federal government without somehow hoping that the federal government is going to limit its own power. He said, without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. To me, this is some of the most essential information that we can get out to the people. Thomas Jefferson, of course, called this the foundation of the Constitution. You heard me cite John Jay, John Dickinson, James Otis Jr., and John Hancock, and so many others in this episode. But this is the kind of information we try to reach and teach more and more people with every single day of the year. And there is absolutely nothing that helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can help me say happy anniversary 10th Amendment Center. Let's kick off the next 18 years by joining us as a member today for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Or if you want to make a one-time donation, if you're already a member, I'm very grateful. If you feel very compelled to join us or to pitch in a little bit more to help us out, we can certainly use your support. 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I'll take a look over in the live chat a little bit later today, see if there's any comments or questions that I can get back to or ideas for future episodes. It's very likely that I'm going to take some time off, if not the whole week off, for Independence Day week, at least doing shows. I don't have the luxury of vacation time. I keep putting in for paid time off, but I keep getting PTO denied. They tell me I've got unlimited PTO here at the 10th Amendment Center, but my boss is a real jerk, so he doesn't give me much time off. But I do read through all your comments and emails and stuff, and I've got a lot of great ideas. I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes from your feedback, so I really appreciate that. You can also smash the like button, leave comments, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Those are some free and easy-peasy ways to trigger algorithms of the mainstream platforms, and it does tell them to show us to more people. I'm very grateful for that help. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.